My guest today is Doug Munroe, who is a professor at Quest University. I was trying to figure out which faculty you're from, but at Quest University is one of those quirky little universities where there's apparently no faculties, and so I can just say you're a professor.
Yes, my background is in politics and in military strategy, with a focus on counterterrorism.
Okay. And you're also a principal and a co-founder of a research box, Politikos Research, based in BC.
Politikos generally does public policy consulting.
Yeah.
So a lot of our clients or would-be clients, because we're just starting out, are governments. We also do political strategy for political parties, doing some geospatial analysis to tell them where they might find sympathetic voters, okay, for example. We're initially operating in BC. We aspire to be Canada-wide. We've just signed a contract, for example, to do some work in Alberta. Definitely staying in Canada for the time being. The cross-border stuff just feels like it's a little bit too complicated.
Yes. And
for our political strategy, we're Canadianists. We're specialists in Canadian politics. American politics as a whole, they're beast.
Yes, the less said about this, perhaps the better. So I thought today what we could do is discuss the idea behind writing proposals and how we budget for projects. I've asked you to do this because you and I have recently written a proposal together, or at least as part of the same team, and I thought your approach to writing the proposals was slightly different from mine, but at least it'd be a good idea to let the students know about different approaches. I'm aware that the proposal we sent in was much more structured than these proposals usually are, because we were competing for a grant against presumably thousands of other people competing for a grant, and so we have to follow specific tracks. But I thought we could also presumably discuss the proposal writing process in general. We can, of course, base it off of some of your experiences when you've written these proposals. But not every proposal you've written is actually part of a competitive process. Presumably every once in a while, the client has already made up their mind that they'd like to work with you, and then we have to sort of get the ball rolling to eventually get to the point where we have a contract. So how do you view proposals? How do you view proposal writing?
I mean, the hardest thing in my experience has been to get to the point where somebody asks you to send them a proposal.
Yes.
Right? Where you've established an initial relationship of some kind, and you've got them interested in what you can do for them. Mm-hmm. In a lot of the work that we do, particularly on the political side, the capabilities that we have are so different from what people are used to. They usually do opinion polls, and that's kind of it. That initially they have a hard time wrapping their minds around the possibilities that we offer. So the hardest part is getting the initial conversation, getting somebody to realize that this is something that they could do. When there's an RFP, it's a bit easier because you know that your prospective client has decided they want to do something, and they've got a pretty good idea of what they want to come out of the whole thing. And they're just deciding whether or not you can make it happen. If there's no RFP, if it's just an unstructured conversation with the prospective client, you're sort of educating the client in that conversation about what's possible and what's feasible. And then you're following up with the written proposal to tell them a little bit more about how long it will take, about what sorts of deliverable they can expect, and most importantly, how much it will cost.
Mm-hmm. I guess in the Vancouver mainland area, you probably don't deal with that many government organizations, whereas in Ottawa, basically every second prospective client is a government department of some kind. And so the idea there is slightly different. In the federal public service, I'd say a good third of their projects go out as RFPs, and at least in my experience, about 2/3 of them, they get in touch with you directly. So they're the ones doing the legwork to find you, and then they ask you to come in and have a meeting and eventually to explain what you could do for them and to put it in a proposal. So in your experience, what's the ratio between like these RFPs where the client has already indicated their interest, the ones where they come to you specifically, and the ones where they haven't come to you and you have to sort of go out there and try to get them to to bite, for lack of a better word.
Well, I mean, the best of all possible worlds as a consultant is where somebody comes to you and says, you've never met me, but I'm really interested in what you can do. And that's usually because they've heard about you from somebody else. Mm-hmm. I mean, we hang a shingle out, we have a website, and that's all great, but it's not very likely that somebody's going to come to you purely from that.
Yes.
Having a website is more useful, I think, because somebody who may have heard of you and through other means will then look there, and the fact that you have a website says to them, oh, these guys are legit.
Yeah.
But they won't discover you that way. It's just a supporting piece of evidence. Most of the work that we've done has either been through opportunities that arise from our outreach and our networking, or through RFPs. We actually monitor RFPs for the vast majority of provinces and also the feds. We just sit on the chain watching the new RFPs come in because we have a small consortium of experts in different fields, and we are looking to find opportunities for them. And then the totally unstructured things, actually the very first consulting gig that I did, aside from some contracting work that I did when I was a public servant in Ottawa, it was because I had done work with the local riding association for a provincial political party. One of the people there who'd been a campaign manager knew that I had some analytical chops, had some questions, knew that I could answer them, and that was a very informal process. But for us, finding the leads, getting the initial conversation is the tricky part, and then the proposal writing comes after that. But because you've already had initial conversation, you have a bit of a feel for what sorts of things your client might want and how familiar they are with the field and methods, and you can start to tailor your pitch to them. And I think that's really, some of the most important stuff here. Very, very much Swenza from The Art of War, right? But you need to kind of know your prospective client.
Your enemy.
Know what they're looking for. Have some notion of how much they can afford. If they're a public sector organization, you need to know the dollar threshold at which they can just say, sure, and sole source it to you, and the dollar threshold where they need to go to an assistant deputy minister level, and the dollar threshold where they need to go to RFP.
So, I mean, you're talking with the public sector organizations, and there's well-established thresholds that you publish available for everybody. If you're going to be working with private sector individuals, even if it comes to political parties in this context, there you view them as private sector individuals. How do you get a sense for how much money they're willing or able to spend? Do you have a sniff test or a nose test that says, given the situation here, if I ask for more than $10,000, it's not going to happen. In other instances, if I only ask for $10,000, they're going to think of me as a non-player, somebody who doesn't ask enough money, and so I have to ask more money than $10,000. Do you have a sense of, or have you developed some sort of a protocol, or are you still basically playing it by ear?
Well, we're not shooting entirely blind. Yeah. But in terms of the know your client half of the equation, we typically work with the local riding level of a party, and you can actually look up their financial returns and get a sense of how much money they look they have in the bank. For political campaigns, we can actually look, and we have, as part of a book project we're working on, at how much they spend. We know the median federal campaign in the last couple of elections spends about $5,000. So we know that half of the possible campaigns have more than $5,000 to spend. And if we price at, say, $2,000, and the product we're offering will help them make the most of the remaining $3,000, well, we think we have a bid, right? We think we've got a lead there we can use, especially if we tell them, listen, you're about to spend a ton of money on signs, and it's a colossal waste of time, and you shouldn't do it. And we'll tell you how to do something better. So you have some notion of what they can spend. Of course, that doesn't mean they will spend it, right? We've done some work, we've written proposals for large nonprofit organizations that do political activism. They've got annual reports online, so you can get a good feel of how much they spend. This one spent upwards of $1 million a year just on salaries. They've got money, but they, in the end, decided not to go ahead with what we had pitched. They were going to try to do their usual thing first, and then if they needed help, they'd come back to us. We pitched to a local party. We knew they had $40,000 in the bank, which, because of the change in the law in BC, they would not be able to spend in an election.
Okay.
But they were not interested in doing what we offered to do, not really because of the cost, but because they weren't sure it was going to be useful. Right? So sometimes it's straight up dollars. We've pitched to campaigns and they've come back to us and said, we love this. We totally want to do it. We can absolutely not afford to do it. Not now or not ever. And we've had other parties who say, yeah, we could do this, but we're not sure it's useful. In BC, for example, there was a possibility of changing the voting system.
Yes.
And the party said, well, I mean, we could do this work right now, but then if we change the voting system, maybe it wouldn't be useful, and we don't really know, and so maybe not.
So the landscape also drives, these financial decisions.
Yeah, it absolutely does, right? When you're dealing with public sector organizations, it's almost more predictable. As you say, you can find out what their thresholds are for making contract awards without consultation or RFP, but they're also often obligated to go with the lowest bid. And so you can kind of think to yourself, okay, on the one hand, I want to know what my client is like. On the other hand, you have to kind of know yourself. Maybe you want to go low on a public sector proposal because there's some strategic benefit to getting to the work.
Yes.
Even if it doesn't work out to being the most handsomely paid contract ever because you put in more hours than you necessarily included, or it ends up costing more. We've put in a proposal to do something where we deliberately bid quite low because we kind of wanted the revenue, even if it wasn't the maximized amount of revenue, but also because as part of this contract, we're going to be acquiring some additional capabilities on the client's dime, but then we retain them afterwards.
Yeah. At the same time as well, some of these RFPs will score you not just on how much you're bidding, but on your skill level, or you'll get points for experience and what have you. So at the end of the day, the more experience points you have, even if you're bidding a bit little higher, when you do the ratio of points to financial bid, you might still come out ahead because you have more experience. Most of your projects, I guess, based on what I'm hearing you say here, wouldn't necessarily fall in the squarely quantitative camp. There's a policy element to them.
Yep.
Now, in quantitative projects, we typically have to be fairly explicit about what methodology we're thinking of using, if only to protect ourselves as well, to say that, we are telling you about things that are real things that exist, and our credentials are established. In the worst case scenario, we have something to fall back on what had been agreed to in the methodology section. That is not necessarily something that would appear in your less quantitative proposals. Do you have a sort of a template of what typically appears no matter what, and then you fine-tune the template based on who you're talking to and what they're looking for? Or do you really, really, really just play it by ear all the time? Like, I know you've told me before that you might not even send a formal proposal to some clients because it's part of a give and take, and the conversation is going well through email or through phone or face to face, and so we'll just sign the contract right off the bat. What's your approach with these things?
Well, so the really informal stuff, obviously it's pretty small dollar value, right? I mean, that one came out to $1,500. I just did the work and invoiced them.
Yeah.
Right. And I live in a pretty small town. I know these people. It was reasonable risk. As you get a little more high stakes, then you want to be a little bit more explicit about what exactly you're going to do. And what we do with the political work is we want to explain enough of the methodology so that people understand the value of what they're getting and they trust the result. So we'll typically explain that we're using a geospatial technique to bridge together two different kinds of data, which are normally not linked. And then we're using we'll just sort of say a regression analysis. We're actually doing a partial least squares model because we've got all kinds of multicollinearity problems and massive, more columns than rows, to put it simply, I guess. And we don't really get deep into the weeds of that because most of our clients do not understand. Yeah. They're ready to just sort of glaze over and they tune out and they don't want to, right? What they want to know is, okay, some smart people who seem credible have said that they do cool stuff and they get answers. And therefore I trust the answers because I trust the people. What we do make very explicit though, when we're pitching on an RFP of some kind, is how exactly are we going to get this done? So if we're going to be pitching for a public consultation process, but it has to be done online because of the ongoing pandemic, we'll be very explicit. We're going to run a multimodal survey. It will be delivered through online means. There will be display ads to promote it. There will be a direct mail component, so you have commensurate data. We will do it with a business reply mail set up so that people can respond. We will randomly select where the survey is sent out, et cetera, et cetera. You get quite specific about how that's going to get done, because that signals to the reader of your proposal that you have thought through how you're going to do it. Right? I mean, it's very easy to say, oh yeah, I'll run this thing, and you don't explain exactly how it's going to happen. The more you can explain how it's going to happen, the more they have an appreciation that you know what you're doing. In the final analysis, particularly for quantitative stuff, if they don't like the result, you can always say, look, I did what I said I was going to do. You don't like, if the world does not agree with you, that's not my problem.
Yeah, no, I agree that in terms of protecting the consultant from, that type of stuff, or from scope creep in general, having a well spelled out proposal basically says, look, this was one of the appendices in the contract that we've signed. You've agreed to this. We can't, suddenly turn around and say, that's the end of that. On the topic of scope creep, is this something that's ever happened to you, or do you? Is it universal to projects that, given the choice, even if they're not trying to be like nefarious about it, I mean, they just might be interested in suddenly that there's more to this than they thought was going to be there. Do you also experience scope creep pretty much in every project, or is this something that you found a way to keep at arm's length?
I mean, a little bit, right? I mean, I think to a certain extent, scope creep is good.
Yes. Because
it means that they're paying attention to what you're doing, and it's raising questions, and they want to know more. One of the earlier contracts that I did, this was a very small buck one, for example, they wanted a lot more. Like, wow, hey, this is really interesting. Can you give us Excel spreadsheets with the output so we can do more with it? Can you look a little bit at this relationship, look at that relationship? You want to be able to give into that a little bit, because it's constructive, right? It helps them think, oh, wow, there's more work here. This person can really do more than I thought they could do, particularly in our work where there isn't a lot of awareness of what's possible. But you also have to be pretty explicit about what is in the original scope. So even though that was all done by phone calls and emails, even in the email, I was pretty sure there's a paragraph that I could point to that said, no, this is exactly what I'm doing, right? I'm giving you a written report. It will have a list of these things. I will give you the Excel spreadsheet. If you want maps, or if you want the underlying code base, or if you want to own the IP, all that's going to be extra. And I'm happy to talk about it, but it's going to be extra.
Yeah, you have to be compensated at a fair value for the work you've done. Otherwise, you become a doormat. And if you become a doormat, well, you still have to put food on your table at the end of the day, right? And so it's a...
Well, so this is the other half, right? Like I've thought recently, it's a lot like Swin's Art of War. The general who knows his adversary and who knows himself will prevail. Yeah. So you need to know what is the minimum amount of money that you need to make out of this contract for it to make sense. What is the point at which it does not make sense for you to do? Either it's a net loss, you never want to be in, or it's just less than you could make with the same amount of time doing something else.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes you will deliberately bid on a contract, even though it's a less optimal use of your time than doing some other thing, because you get some kind of strategic payoff.
Yeah.
So Politikos, for example, we're fairly new as a consulting firm. All of our members have done lots of consulting individually. There's a strategic benefit to us in building up a client base and reputation. So we're okay with bidding low on stuff. And we've designed the firm to have trivial overhead costs, so that we can afford to bid on smaller work than most of our competitors. But you also want to make sure you're not bidding on work and chasing work just to get something, or agreeing to whatever extension of scope people ask for just to kind of get something. You do need to be able to say, look, I'm sorry, I'd love to help you out, but it is just not worth it to me. I have some other contracts that can be doing.
There's only so much.
It's really helpful when you do your proposal to kind of work out what's the floor, the dollar value beneath which this does not make sense for you to work on anymore.
There's only so much exposure you can get, right? At some point, you got to be able to. You're getting the exposure for an ultimate goal of not needing exposure anymore, so you can work on these projects.
And people often, they're reluctant to price their time in that way. Like you'll think, well, gee, in my day job, my time is N dollars an hour, so I don't want to price it more than that because I feel awkward doing that. But you have to recognize that the price you charge as a consultant needs to cover all of the hours in which you don't get paid.
Yes.
Right? It has to keep you in being and in operation as a consultant, even if you aren't working on the project. So there's sort of a premium for the hours in which you are paid that offsets the hours in which you're not. Yeah. And the client recognizes that because they aren't choosing between paying you your consulting fee or paying you your employee fee for the same number of hours. Mm-hmm. They're either going to pay you the consulting fee or they're going to hire a person, and it's going to be far more expensive than having you consult.
I like to think of it as being equivalent. Like if I was an artist, for instance, like a commission might only take me 3 hours to prepare, but you're also paying for all of the work that I've done previously in my life to get to the point where I can do the commission in 3 hours. And so you're not just paying for the actual service, you're paying for the whole package. I mean, the client might say, it's not my fault that you don't have enough consulting projects to be able to get paid when you're not working, or get paid when I'm working on me. But at the same time, if they want to work with you on this project, it becomes it becomes part of their ecosystem. They can't just wash their hands away from the fact that that's really part of the equation. From a budgeting perspective, so the importance of pricing yourself out accordingly. Mm-hmm. Usually I have in my mind an idea as to how much I want to charge for the project. And then I work back from there the number of hours that I'm willing to spend on various tasks, and that as have been outlined in the methodology. I know when you and I and Dimitri applied to this RFP, the budget allocation was a little bit of a, I want to say, contentious issue, but it wasn't clear how we would really fully work it out. What's your general approach towards budgeting, your time and resources, as well as how much money you'll pay for these resources to various tasks, so that you come under a specific budget?
It's very, very easy to have a good idea and to get excited about it, and then you got to get down to the money, and then it starts getting a bit awkward, right? Typically what I do is I kind of run two processes, either sequentially or in parallel. Right? The first is I sort of think about, look, what's the ceiling on this? And if it's an RFP, that's great, because they told you what the ceiling is. Yeah. And if not, you're kind of guessing, right? Like, how much do I think they could spend? And if you have no idea how much they can spend, then you just sort of take a stab and then you go back to the second plan. But I kind of work backwards from how much I think they can spend. And I took a look, as you say, at the work plan. What are the steps that have to go into this? What are the inputs? And if there's stuff that I have to acquire, if there's data acquisition or capability acquisition, that's easy. That's just a fixed price input. And then you look at the steps that you've got and you think, okay, well, how many hours is it going to take to do this? And of course, everything takes longer and costs more than you think about, right? So you're trying to hedge for that, but you don't want to overdo it. And this is where the strategy comes in. You think a little bit, well, I'm budgeting 3 hours of work for this thing. If it takes 5, it's not the end of the world, right? I'd be okay with that if there was some overrun.
You wouldn't charge more. You would just say that was 3 hours.
Yeah, you just eat those extra 2 hours because maybe it's worth it to you because you're learning some useful skill or you have some payoff for it. But typically I kind of start building up, right? How many hours do I think each step of the project is going to take? And what's the billable rate for the various people involved, and what sorts of other inputs and capabilities you need? You add that all up, and hopefully it comes to a sum that is about equal to the amount you think that they're going to pay. That almost never happens, right? Typically, you wind up with a bit more, and then you're thinking, okay, well, go back over the assumptions. Can I shave the hours a little bit? Am I willing to embrace the risk that it actually takes me 6 hours and I've allocated 2? because I'm just going to have to eat those 4 hours. Like I can't turn around and say to them, hey, I know we agreed on 20,000, but now it's 25. Oops. So the more you shave that, the more you're embracing a bit of risk that you're going to wind up working more than you're getting paid, and therefore your average hourly wage is lower. And then you're also kind of thinking, maybe we have room to expand a little bit here, right? Or maybe I'm going to build in a contingency in some respects. You got to think about your admin overhead. Mm-hmm. Right? That's something people often kind of forget. We're signing a contract, for example. It's a requirement of the contract that we have a very comprehensive insurance policy.
Yes. That's
a $2,000 a year expense for us. So if that's not factored in somewhere, then you're going to start coming up short at the end of the year, right? But typically, I kind of get a ballpark of where I think we can make this work based on what I know about the client. And then I kind of think about how much it's going to take hours-wise for each thing. The project that we worked on has a lot of different components and phases and steps where it's very difficult for us to assess how long it's going to take. But we know, having done this a few times, that processing and prepping the data is going to be very time-consuming. But it's also something we can probably outsource and get some help on. Whereas constructing the specific machine learning algorithms is going to be expert-level work. So you think about your allocations in there, and you kind of try to line those two things up as best you can. The one of the contracts we recently did, we deliberately bid a lot lower than the maximum amount, which was already a pretty small amount of money. I think there were probably fewer bids than the municipality would have wanted. But what we did is we said, look, they had a $20,000 threshold or ceiling. We said for $14,000, we can meet your spec and we'll do it in these ways. And then for an extra $2,000, we can do this thing. And for an extra $3,000, we can do this thing. And so on up to $20,000. And then we basically said to them, so you pick.
Yeah.
Do you want the minimum for 14 grand? Because we can do that. Or do you want the full 20 grand and we'll do the extras for you? And we ended up lining the contract for the minimum. And I suspect it's because their own internal scoring system is such that the minimum is weighted very, very highly. But we clearly signaled that we could do more. Had we just integrated all of that into the bid, I'm not sure we would have gone.
Yeah, give people the option to choose while protecting yourself as well. So I do remember having had a fairly big project with a group in Toronto where we had given them 3 options. Like one option was like we could, this is a 5-year plan, and here we have a 1-year plan, and then there's, you can go any sort of levels between the 1-year plan and the 5-year plan at these costs as well. And we had the same sort of situation where that was fairly well received.
I think the most important thing in my experience so far, I guess there's 2 things, right? I mean, having been on the other end of this as a public servant, what I've realized is that particularly in the public sector, the person you're talking to, they actually just kind of want to get a job done.
Yeah.
And what you really want to do is make it as easy as possible for them to say yes to you to get the job done. And in many cases, they don't want to deal with an RFP, or if they do deal with an RFP, they really don't have a lot of latitude about the outcome. So you want to figure out how to make their life as easy as possible.
Yes.
So how can I make it easy for you to say yes? If that means that my bid has to come in at just under $5,000, then I'm going to figure out if I can possibly do this for less than $5,000 because it'll make it easier for you to say yes. But the other thing to keep in mind, I think, is that you're going to miss on most of the proposals you make. Like the success rate here, up until last week, I think we were bidding about 50%.
Yeah.
The denominator has crept up a little bit in the last couple of days, so we're now in like the 30 to 40% range. That's how it goes. So you really, you want to make sure that each proposal you make is something that you're proud of and you're happy with, and you would 100% do that job if it was offered to you. But you don't want to invest any more effort than is required to get it to that point, because the odds are it will not come to anything. And you got to put a lot of lines in the water before you get enough fish on the end of it to kind of make the whole thing work.
Words of wisdom, definitely. if I'm quizzing you real fast, I want to get your gut reaction to something. Proposal writing, fun or not?
I'll be honest with you, it's fun. I like it because every time is a new and interesting challenge. Again, most of our work comes out of a consultation call. So I meet the person, usually virtually these days. I get to know why they're doing what they're doing. I get to know what they want to know more about. We start getting excited about what we could maybe do for them. And we can figure out some new stuff here. There's a whole bunch of novel applications for the stuff that we do that we're just discovering. It's fun to then write it up and say, yeah, we could do this, we could do this, we could do this. And you give them lots of choices. It's enjoyable. It's a little intellectual challenge every time. And sometimes it doesn't go anywhere. But sometimes it does. And I think the more we do it, I think the more interesting it gets. What we've noticed right now is that there are more opportunities than we have time to pursue.
It's a good position to be in, right?
Yeah, that's definitely a good position to be in.
Now, you say that, but of course you have a master's in literature, so presumably if you were mostly a quantitative person, you might look at writing a proposal as like a task which is not a pleasant task.
An onerous one, yes. I have to say that's just a weird Britishism. It's just a master's degree in international security studies. I don't know why they call it master of literature. But I wasn't reading Chaucer or anything for that. But yes.
But I guess
I do a lot of writing.
A necessary part of the process, right? We have to go out and put ourselves out there. We need to tell people what it is that we're going to do for them. Otherwise, we cannot move on to the next step of actually having a signed agreement with a client.
Yep. Yeah, and until the ink is dry, it's all speculative, right? It's all fun and games. Writing a really good proposal that's very explicit about what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and how much it's going to cost is the basis for an easy contractual review process. Mm-hmm. If your proposal is murky, then your contract is murky, and if you don't get that dialed in, everything after that is going to be bad. So time invested in writing a good proposal is time that sets you up for a much easier ride afterwards.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Doug, for taking the time to discuss proposals and budgeting with us.
Always a pleasure.
We'll see you soon.
Well, Patrick, I hope you have a chance to write many proposals together in the future.
Sure we will.
All right. Take it easy.